The global supply chain, the primary source of how global commerce operates, is a vital part of what makes our economy work. But supply chains have been on shaky ground as demand continues to grow. Headlines around the world have been highlighting the disruptions, which many of us have experienced on a personal level, whether it's empty shelves at stores to rising prices for everyday goods. While most of us are simply wondering if there's an end in sight, it's important for investors to also ask, what is the long-term impact on our economy and investment markets? My name is Neuberger Berman, and to kick off 2022, we'll be starting a series of conversations around this extremely hot topic. Today, I'm joined by Michael Barr, who returns to the show to speak more about what's going on in freight and supply chain management today. Michael, thanks for coming back.
Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
Now, Michael, we've been seeing headlines for months now about these supply chain shortages. So just to get kicked off, give our listeners the background of how and why these disruptions started in the first place, because it's not as simple as just blaming it all on COVID, right?
Oh, totally. I think the easy thing to do has been to blame it on COVID. But when you sit back and think about it, everyone can remember the trade disputes in 2018 and 2019. That created an impetus for a lot of companies to get ahead of tariff they were fearful were in place. That pull forward of demand created an imbalance in the supply chain. In and of itself, that's not bad, except in March of 2020, COVID hit and the entire global economy shut down. Again, that in and of itself, not bad. The problem is no one told the consumer that they were supposed to shut down. So the consumer kept buying during that whole shutdown, mostly through e-commerce. A lot of what we were delivering was through inventory. So by the time a lot of the production capabilities came back online, the damage was already done. The supply chains were out of balance, inventories were low, and the demand was still robust. So that was basically the whole dynamic. If you want some examples of that, I think it's important to note that between basically the last decade, e-commerce as a percent of total retail sales has grown from about 5 to 15%. Great growth, but it's still on a controlled basis. Since the pandemic, that jumped in 1 year from 15 to 20% roughly. And you can see the impact that that's going to have and the really strong demand that the consumer kind of showed during that past year during all the lockdowns.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think we can all relate to the huge increase in online shopping, particularly around the March time period of COVID. Tell us about what's currently going on with the backlog today. How are the ports managing it?
So we'll talk about ports first. The ports are struggling. You can't turn on a TV or an evening news broadcast without somebody counting the ships at port or the ships coming into port. So that's a known dynamic. The other thing that's happened, we talked about earlier, is the inventory levels are low. So the demand is really coming from both servicing demand from the consumer and an attempt to restock inventory. But the issue really isn't just the ports, right? I think it's really safe to make sure we understand that it's not just the ships coming in. Yes, that's a bottleneck, but getting the goods out of the ports where we have a lack of equipment. So you hear about chassis shortage. We have a lack of equipment to use to get those containers off of the ships onto either trucks or rails and get them to their final destination. So we're lacking that. So this goes back into the imbalance. We got to get some of those chassis equipment back to the ports, which are being stuck inland. The other thing we're having a lot of huge issues on is driver demand. We don't have the drivers to move all the goods. We know that there was an effort to open the ports for 24 hours, but unless you can get more and more drivers and more equipment into the ports, it doesn't really matter how long the ports are open if you don't have that release valve. So, there's a lot of, the ports get a lot of the headlines, but it goes all the way across the supply chain where all the problems and the dynamic are creating.
Yeah, it sounds like an unfortunate perfect storm of multiple issues upon issues. So a lot of complex issues to navigate. And obviously, if this does persist, it could push inflation further as well, which is on everyone's mind at the moment. So Michael, actually just curious, what are some of the industries that have been most impacted by the disruption? What are they actually doing about it? And any examples of initiatives from companies that you can share would be really helpful.
Right. Well, if ports are always on the news, the second story is either going to be the semiconductors or the autos, right? So those are the headlines. But again, it's so much more than that. We've actually heard some of our railroad companies talk about hearing data points that some of their customers are talking about building infrastructure in the U.S. So bringing production capabilities back to the U.S. to help deal with some of the supply chain issues. We have heard companies like Samsung and Taiwan Semiconductor talk about investing for capabilities and infrastructure in the US again. Once again, another example of the reshoring or nearshoring phenomenon. And finally, some of the examples we've heard is GM and Ford have talked about building more strategic relationships with semiconductors. You would have never heard about that in the past. And this is just some of what's happening and the dynamics that the stretched supply chain is creating. It's both an opportunity and a risk, but it's definitely interesting to see how some of these companies are trying to account for this problem.
Another area that I'm sure we're seeing a lot of focus on is warehouse automation. What innovations are you seeing companies putting into place, and how do you see that evolving going forward?
Right. So I think this is a huge opportunity and huge interest point for this supply chain alleviation, the automation of warehouses and distribution centers. Now, we all have seen the YouTube videos of Amazon warehouses with their cobots running around helping with the picking and the pack. But the fact of the matter is, roughly only 10 to 20% of warehouses and distribution centers globally are automated. So you can see when you have that step change function in e-commerce, you can see the pressure that can create on the supply chain, specifically the warehouses and distribution centers. So in our mind, we think that's a huge opportunity and a huge investment that's going to take place in the coming years. That is the automation of warehouse. The other thing to think about from an automation point of view is as we're buying more and more stuff online, the return characteristics are much more challenging, right? Bringing something back to a store, they just kind of refold it and put it back on the shelves and sell it again. When you buy something and send it back, it has to go through a whole network of the supply chain from a pickup at your house to back to the distribution centers to restocking to approval that the package is not damaged, and then wait for it to be sold again where it's shipped and sit on a truck and get to the next person's house. That's extremely expensive, and it changes the dynamic when on average, 1 out of every 3 or 4 packages are returned. Think about that extra cost that needs to be taken into account for. So we think the automation and finding ways to more efficiently handle delivery, finding ways to more efficiently handle returns is the evolution of what's happening right now. And it's more like a moving tide that's just going to raise all boats, but it's something that is going to happen in the near future.
Yeah, thanks very much. And you just reminded me that I need to send a package back shortly that I ordered. I think one of the questions that a lot of folks will have is, is this the new normal? Is there a mindset shift that's now needed in consumers that things are just going to take longer to ship? Or do you think that consumer demand is going to slow down in reaction to the price pressure that we're facing? Michael, what do you see for the global supply chain going forward?
Right. So I think it's fair to make the statement that consumer purchasing behavior has changed. We now expect to be able to pull up our iPhones or smart devices, order a package, and expect whatever we order to be there in 2 days. That's just a structural change. So unless we find a way to dial that back, which I am not expecting, and anybody who's listening to this probably have no interest in ordering something and waiting a week before it shows up, I think that change is not occurring. So that means it's going to have to be corrected on the supply side chain. And that's basically more efficient last mile delivery, more efficient line haul, and more efficient warehouses and distribution centers. That's a huge investment that these companies are going to need to take on. But I think it's the only way out going forward. From an inflation point of view, I think there is going to be higher costs. But if the consumer is proven, if you can get value for the money you're spending, you're willing to pay up a little bit. Now, I don't think you can charge, $2 and all of a sudden start charging $20. But I think slightly higher costs on delivery is going to be the new norm. Obviously, down the line with automated trucks and automated delivery systems, then you'll start bending the cost curve back down. But I think in the near term, there's just going to be upward pressure. The companies will absorb it for as much as they can. So I don't think it's happening tomorrow, but I think over time, there's just going to be upward pressure, both from either a consumer spending or from a company cost profile. That's saying it's not going to be 100%, but overall supply chain costs are going to go up. I think the other thing we should think about is we went really aggressively over the past 2 decades or so towards just-in-time inventory. The pendulum has probably swung too far, and we're kind of probably coming back and going to see some form of buffer stock within our inventory channels. That's not a big deal. It's just going to elongate the supply chain. I think when people, like I said, we've talked about in the beginning, the flagship of the ports, I think, at any given week, the past month or so, it's been about 100 ships at some point in queue going into the West Coast ports. That number is obviously going to go down over time as the supply chain smooths out and gets more fluid, but that's not going to go back to historic levels probably, right? The new norm is going to be an elevated number. So I think when you sit back and think about it, it's probably going to be slightly elevated costs, and that can be both absorbed by the companies and the consumer. Slightly elongated supply chain, which I don't think is a big deal, but something that should be thought about, and kind of a new norm of congestion. I think there's just going to be more goods in motion than we've had in the past. And like I said, those all are dynamics, assuming that the consumer doesn't change its buying patterns. And I think we can all agree that the consumer probably isn't going to change our buying patterns. I would argue we're going to go closer to 1 day or same day before we go back to 7 day.
I guess that now, the consumer's in a very strong position that the consumer can absorb some of that price pressure impact, but there is probably a certain level where the consumer, starts to slow down with spending.
Mm-hmm. And I the fact of the matter is the consumer's been very healthy. That's a good thing for the economy.
Right.
And that's a good thing for these companies, right? You're getting a lot of goods. What they don't want to have is missed sales, right? Because their inventory is low. So I think a lot of these companies are racing to build up their inventory to service consumer that is still high on good demands.
And you mentioned missed sales. Michael, explain what that is, and is that something that you're hearing from more and more companies at the moment?
We are hearing more about this. Now, it's not the end of the economic cycle, but it's just a dynamic that shows the stress of the supply chain. And we're hearing over the past few quarters how every once in a while companies are highlighting they've missed a certain amount of sales because shelves were empty. Shelves are empty means distribution centers are empty. We had a fascinating conversation with UPS and FedEx earlier this year about how they would have had higher volume if their customers had more product to ship. No one doesn't want to ship something. If there's a demand for it, you want to service the demand. And I think that just highlights the tightness, and nothing that's overly surprising when you turn on the television and watch it or go into the store and see it. It just shows the stress that exists. And nowadays we can't solve it with just throwing more labor at the problem like we've done in the past. One, it's hard to get the labor, and two, as more and more demand is coming through e-commerce and individual channels instead of pallets to a brick and mortar store, that creates more individual picking and packing demand that is going to be harder and harder to service on a timely basis by human labor, and is going to need some sort of automated robotic assistance. Now, we're not saying robots are going to take over, but there's a definition called cobots, and those are basically robots that work in conjunction with humans at warehouses. And we think this is going to be a big trend over the next 1 to 5 years as we try to solve for the tightness in the supply chain and find release valves.
All right, terrific. And Michael, as a bonus question, I wanted to ask, we're talking a lot about ports at the moment. If we're thinking about, pre-pandemic or a post-pandemic environment, what is your favorite port city to visit just for fun? I'm a Florida girl, so the port of Tampa Bay is my personal favorite. But what about for you, Michael?
Well, let's be honest. Everyone loves to go to Miami, so that's fun. But I think one that's great is Port of Charleston. Love going to Charleston. I think that's a great fun city. Great food. You can play some golf. You still got the beach. That's a pretty good one. But also, let's be honest, LA is pretty good too. So there's a lot of good ones. Now that I'm thinking about it, Vancouver. You go skiing. Wow, this is a good game. I should do that more often.
Good to end this on a positive note. Michael, this has been a great conversation about supply chains. Really appreciate your insights and outlook going forward, and particularly some of those innovations that you mentioned earlier on. I personally am looking forward to continuing this series with some of your colleagues over the next few weeks. But again, thanks for taking the time to speak with me today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And to our listeners, if you liked what you've heard here today on Disruptive Forces, I invite you to subscribe to the show via Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, or you can visit our website at www.nb.com/disruptive forces for previous episodes, as well as more information about our firm and offerings.
This podcast contains general market commentary, general investment education, and general information about Neuberger Berman. It is for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. This communication is not directed at any investor or category of investors and should not be regarded as investment advice or a suggestion to engage in or refrain from any investment-related course of action. All information is current as of the date of recording and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of the firm as a whole. This material may include estimates, outlooks, projections, and other forward-looking statements. Due to a variety of factors, actual events or market behavior may differ significantly from any views expressed. Please refer to the disclosures contained in the episode notes and episode details, which are an important part of this communication. Investing entails risks, including the possible loss of principal. Past performance is no guarantee of future results.